One cannot bear witness to the Shoah by merely integrating it into a story about the development of a European or world sensibility. But neither can we retreat from the necessity of thinking the impossible. Jeffrey Hartman has recently suggested that despite all the texts that have been devoted to the Shoah, all the ways we have constructed of remembering the Shoah, all the reminders we have invented in order not to forget, despite all this, we have not yet begun to think about the Shoah, and perhaps we never will know how to think, which is not an invitation not to think, far from it. It is rather an invitation not to stop trying, not to act as if we could settle the matter once and for all. I do not say this from a position of certainty, but rather one of radical uncertainty. The question remains then, how to think ethically after the Shoah. I want to avoid any straightforward celebration of the merely confessional, which does not mean that one can legitimately ignore testimony or dispense with the need for others to witness. Foucault, perhaps more than anyone else, has taught us to be wary of what it is we are doing when we confess, whether we confess our sins in a religious setting to a religious authority, or whether we tell the truth about ourselves from a couch in the presence of a psychoanalyst. Foucault did not mean to suggest that confession has no place, but rather that we must pay attention to what it is that sets in motion our will to confess, to what authority governs our confession, and whether the aim and purpose of confession is clear to us. Insofar as witnessing amounts to confession, we should be prepared to be vigilant about what we take ourselves to be answerable for, in the name of what motivation or by what right we confess, and to whom we take ourselves to be confessing. Who or what sanctions our confession? What can testimony accomplish? The Foucauldian suspicion that we harbor about the mechanics of confession may be legitimate, but it is based on an assumption about the nature of confession that is uprooted by Levinas's understanding of what constitutes testimony. Testimony is not to be conflated with the confession of the soul. For Levinas, testimony testifies not to the experience of the individual who is offering witness. It testifies to the infinite, neither to a prior experience of one who is confessing past sins, nor simply to the witness of one who has undergone a trauma and for whom testifying presents a means of recovery. Testimony, in Levinas's sense, is not concerned with self-expression. It is precisely an expression of the infinite. The function of testimony in Levinas's philosophy is perhaps best understood by focusing on two other concepts whose meaning we might be tempted ordinarily to take for granted, as if we could be confident in our ability to know what we are saying when we name language and religion. For Levinas, language is not merely a reflection of things. It is not merely a doubling up of thought and being, as he says, and religion cannot be understood by reference to some kind of religious experience. Levinas brings into question and reworks these received meanings. Understood as saying without a said, language does not refer to a prior meaning or to the contents of consciousness. It is what makes sincerity possible. Levinas likens saying to silence. As silence speaking, as excess, saying bears witness to the other. Saying, as testimony, signifies prior to all experience. Levinas calls pure testimony an obedience that precedes the hearing of any order. Thus, the sense of the religious that is implicated in this hearing cannot depend on a previous experience. Religious discourse, as Levinas understands it, is not a matter of attesting to my experience. It does not occur in my name, but, quote, in the name of God. It is the here I am, an obedience that resists thematization, which is, quote, said to a neighbor to whom I am given over, end quote, but which comes from elsewhere, expressing, albeit inadequately representing, the infinite. In his presentation of Franz Rosenzweig's thought, in an essay first presented in 1964, Levinas says, religion is not here a confession, but the texture or drama of being prior to philosophy's totalization. Levinas represents, as the characteristic trait of Rosenzweig's thought, a movement that, in leading him to Judaism, also leads him to the recognition of Christianity. He tells the story of Rosenzweig returning from the brink of conversion to Christianity to Judaism. This personal and religious crisis not only constitutes a turning point in Rosenzweig's biography for Levinas, it also frames his central insight into the relationship of Judaism to Christianity. Levinas says, "The Jew must then remain a Jew, even from a Christian point of view. That is why, on the brink of conversion, Rosenzweig, held by Judaism, considered apostasy impossible and useless. His homage to Christianity consisted in his remaining Jewish," end quote. I want to sketch the trajectory that Levinas follows in articulating the reciprocal necessity that Rosenzweig discovers in the meaning Judaism has for Christianity and Christianity holds for Judaism. In mapping Rosenzweig's discovery, Levinas deepens our understanding of religion, despite the fact that this word does not appear in Rosenzweig's The Star of Redemption, which Levinas calls the book of his life. In the course of this mapping, Levinas also offers a reading of creation, revelation, and redemption, the three notions central to Rosenzweig and on which Levinas confers the Kantian dignity of categories or syntheses of understanding. Levinas's reading allows us to see a correspondence between the role that Rosenzweig attributes to these three pivotal concepts in The Star of Redemption and Heidegger's critique of the traditional conception of temporality. At a conference dedicated to the question of ethics after the Holocaust, a presentation of this conjunction of thinkers and themes may seem curious. Heidegger's thinking has become notoriously tainted by his Nazi sympathies, while Rosenzweig's synthetic treatment of Judaism and Christianity predates the Shoah. Why choose to discuss two such problematic figures in this context? By way of a response, let me quote from the preface of Totality and Infinity, the 1961 book that is generally recognized to be the work in which Levinas first sets forth in a developed way his original philosophy. Quote, "We were impressed by the opposition to the idea of totality in Franz Rosenzweig's The Star of Redemption, a work too often present in this book to be cited. But the presentation and the development of the notions employed owe everything to the phenomenological method," end quote. Although it is Husserl and not Heidegger to whom Levinas refers in the comments directly following this twofold debt of acknowledgement, the Husserlian influence on Levinas is never innocent of Heidegger's challenge to the founder of phenomenology. By considering the Heideggerian inflection of Levinas's response to Rosenzweig, we will not only reflect on two of the thinkers to have deeply influenced Levinas, thinkers whose influence produces attention in Levinas's philosophy, we will also prepare for the discussion of death and temporality that I want to engage in the second part of this paper, themes that cannot be evaded if we are to confront what it means to philosophize after the Shoah. In reconsidering this particular essay, written by a Jewish philosopher who lived through the experience of forced labor in a prisoner's camp during the war years, which many members of his family did not survive, it is far from irrelevant that Rosenzweig anticipated in an important sense the crisis of humanity that was to occur during the Shoah, and that Heidegger's philosophy was to become implicated in that crisis. Neither is it irrelevant that Rosenzweig's work was explicitly and overtly an affirmation and interrogation of his Judaism, while Heidegger did not want his philosophy to be read through the lens of Christianity. Let me begin this brief discussion of the important essay Levinas dedicates to the life and thought of Rosenzweig by recalling a statement from it that could be taken as axiomatic of Levinas's philosophy too. Levinas says, "Rosenzweig's thought presents itself as a revolt against Hegel." Given Rosenzweig's impact on shaping the concerns that were to preoccupy Levinas in his own work, not least the rejection of a recourse to totality, what Levinas singles out as a hallmark in Rosenzweig's thought, it is hardly surprising that Levinas's thought could be equally well described as a revolt against Hegel. Evidence of this can easily be found. Rosenzweig, in Levinas's words, retrieved for philosophy the importance of pre-philosophical experiences. and opposed the imprisonment of the individual by the system or the supremacy of totality and the state. If Rosenzweig denies the totality of being, so too is Levinas's work structured by the irreducible singularity or the acute uniqueness of subjectivity, by a refusal to submit to the power to dominate and integrate the totality of being in a self-consciousness, a refusal to be circumscribed or reduced to a particular case of the universal. Just as the individual cannot be sublimated by a system of thought that would supersede it, so religion, in Levinas's words, is not a stammering precursor of humanity's philosophical adventure. Rather, Rosenzweig discerns in religion, according to Levinas, a life that, in a precise sense, is alive. It is alive in the sense of being life that surmounts the immobility of concepts and limits. But what it means for Judaism to be alive and what it means for Christianity to be alive marks the difference between the two religions. Levinas says, quote, "Judaism is alive and true to the degree that it stays close by God, while Christianity is alive and true as a mission to the extent that it marches into the world and penetrates it," end quote. Both Christianity and Judaism exhibit a partial truth. Quote, "The truth that is one in God becomes two outside God. Partial in Christianity, it is related to the also partial truth of Judaism. The truth in itself is articulated and split in the human," end quote. The fact that truth is partial, far from soliciting a relaxation on the part of the individual, entails that this truth, as my truth, is a commitment that is inescapable and irremissible. Thus, Judaism and Christianity are not seen as limiting one another reciprocally, but each one claiming the infinity of the human. As such, Judaism and Christianity are irreducible, both to each other and to a higher truth, whether this ostensible authority presents itself in the secular guise of the state or as the claim of judgment by anonymous history. Judaism and Christianity thus take on the meaning of primordial structures, says Levinas. They are primarily two ways of relating the time of the individual and the passing of instants to absolute time. Elaborating the sense in which the Judaic and Christian religions can be understood as temporal relations, Levinas specifies the significance that Rosenzweig attaches to creation, revelation, and redemption as respectively connected to the past, present, and future. In doing so, he draws on Heidegger's understanding of temporality as ecstatico-horizonal unity. Of creation, Levinas says, quote, "The relation between God and the world is accomplished as always past. Creation opens and sustains the dimension of the past. The past does not merely house creation. Revelation, as the movement of God toward man and human singularity, is to be understood as love, or more specifically, as Levinas says, as God's commandment to love." And Levinas says, "The present is the time of revelation, just as the past was shown to be the time of creation." Emphasizing the sense in which commandment does not amount to a moral formalism, Levinas insists that Judaism enacts rather the specific and concrete relation between the individual and the world. He thereby expresses the continuity that he sees between Rosenzweig's interpretation of Judaism and Heidegger's deformalized, ecstatic conception of temporality. Levinas says, "Judaism, woven of commandments, attests the renewal of the instance of God's love for man. Commandment has the sense of the living presence of love, or, and here Levinas appeals to a Heideggerian term, the very temporalization of the present. If creation sustains the dimension of the past, and if revelation as commandment and as love is the temporalization of the present, it falls to redemption to play the role of the time of the future. Redemption, says Levinas, lays out the future. For Rosenzweig, as Levinas describes it, revelation is the present that ushers in a redemptive future. It is revelation that begins the redemptive work, that is the work of human love. Levinas says, quote, "The revelation, which is love, awaits man's response. This response does not ascend the path opened up by the movement come from God. The response to the love God bestows on man is the love of man for his neighbor, end quote. Whereas Christianity is seen as a mission that goes out into the world, evangelizing, Judaism is seen as closed in upon itself. Judaism, says Levinas, begins with the end, while Christianity, he says, is always at the beginning. For Judaism, man is the mediator of redemption, the indispensable relay of the movement that began in God. But Christianity's eternity, says Levinas, is an eternal relay, a march, a mission. Judaism negates the chronological order of time, joins time and eternity through the collective life of a community that is already established, quote, by the birth of its members, naturally close by the Lord, end quote. Although, Levinas goes on, the Messiah has not yet come. Christianity, on the other hand, Levinas tells us, traverses the world, takes the chronology of the world seriously, moves from incarnation to second coming. When Levinas adds that Christianity is an irremissible expansion and that it transforms pagan into Christian society, subjugating institutions and persons, founding cultures and countries, it is difficult not to see in these lines an echo of the question Levinas asked in his 1934 essay, Reflections on the Philosophy of Hitlerism. The question is, what made possible the confusion of Christian universalism with the racist particularism of Nazism? Having sketched the differences between Judaism and Christianity that Levinas traces in Rosenzweig's work, and having seen how Levinas establishes a parallel between Heidegger's theory of temporality and the categories of Rosenzweig's thought, let me draw attention to two aspects of the temporal schema that Levinas elicits from Rosenzweig, both of which are implicit in what has already been said, the role of ecstasis and the role of death. In Levinas's account of the three elements that dominate Rosenzweig's thinking, creation, revelation, and redemption, can be discerned the pervasive influence of the ecstatic relationship that pertains between these three dimensions. This ecstasy, or being beyond, standing out from itself, is modeled on Heidegger's conception of the way in which the temporal ecstasies of past, present, and future constitute a unity such that they are irrevocably interwoven with one another. A relationship of mutuality and reciprocity informs Levinas's description of creation, revelation, and redemption, such that each depends upon, derives from, and calls for the other. Quote, God and man, the conjunction is precisely creation. God and man, the bond is precisely revelation. Man and the world, but man already illuminated by the revelation and the world already marked by creation is precisely redemption, end quote. The role that Levinas identifies for mortality is of particular importance for us. Notwithstanding the extent of Levinas's debt to Heidegger's critique of the traditional Western conception of time, which he fully acknowledges here as elsewhere, we see the emergence of a decisive difference between Levinas's view of time and Heidegger's account of the ecstatic unity of temporality. This divergence can be provisionally stated in terms of the weight that Levinas and Heidegger attach to the meaning of death. In the words of Michel Arre, quote, only by way of a relation to its death can Dasein grasp its own temporality, end quote. Whereas for Heidegger, at least in Being and Time, Dasein's anticipation of death is the pivotal feature of his entire analysis of temporality. The priority given to one's own death, while still important for Levinas, does not enjoy the uncontested privilege it has in the analysis of Being and Time. Levinas says, quote, love is stronger than death, but death makes redeeming love possible, end quote. Elsewhere, he describes my responsibility to the other as a devotedness as strong as death, and in a sense stronger than death. In finitude, death outlines a destiny which it interrupts, but nothing can dispense me from the response which I am passively held to. The tomb is not a refuge, it is not a pardon, the debt remains. To love one's neighbor is for Levinas to redeem the world. It is also to go to eternity. as he says. In 1947, Levinas published 2 inconspicuous volumes, Le temps et l'autre and De l'existence à l'existant, which together constitute a serious and far-reaching critique of Heidegger's understanding of Dasein's being toward death and the existential analytic that is implicated in this understanding. Levinas continues to develop his critique in various essays, in Totality and Infinity, and more recently in lectures presented in the 1970s. I want here to do no more than sketch this critique, and, although I cannot do justice to it, to draw out some of its implications. According to Heidegger, if death is to be ontologically clarified, the sense in which death is an end for Dasein must be distinguished from the ending of something present at hand or ready to hand. In order to see the specific meaning that Heidegger gives to the dying of Dasein, we cannot equate this ending with the encountering of a limit, boundary, or barrier, at least not in the ordinary sense. As Derrida points out, Heidegger, quote, distinguishes the death of Dasein from any other end, from any other limit. This crucial distinction, which Heidegger considers indispensable, allows him to situate his existential analysis of death before any metaphysics of death and before all biology, end quote. As a negation of life that cannot be experienced, death might be thought to provide the border of life, constituting a boundary or limit. But since Dasein is only this side of death, the nothingness of death can only be anticipated. To think of death as a barrier, as that which prevents me from getting a conceptual grasp on my life as a whole, is to see the nullity of death as that which hinders me from ever being complete, fulfilled, or whole. Heidegger's point is that ontologically, to exist is to lack completion, and that this lack is the very nature of what it means for Dasein to exist. To exist comprehendingly is therefore to take account of one's mortality, not by thinking death as a limit, which is to imply that it could be transgressed. The impossibility of death for Dasein becomes the ground of its possibility. Fundamental to Dasein's being is its lack of being, its lack of completion, its finitude. This is another quote from Derrida. Dasein is always in a position of surpassing a border in the sense of a limit, end, or telos. Dasein is the very transgression of this borderline. In Heidegger's language, Dasein is already its not yet. Its ending is a being towards the end. And in this sense, death, says Heidegger, in the widest sense, is a phenomenon of life. It is Dasein's way of being, distinct from the ending of other things that are alive, which Heidegger reserves the term perishing. Dasein's dying, as the way of being in which Dasein is towards its death, can be authentic or inauthentic. Dasein's dying can amount to a mere demise, or it can be understood as, quote, thrown being towards its own most potentiality for being, which is non-relational and not to be outstripped, end quote. No account of Levinas's critique of the Heideggerian theme of being toward death can ignore the influence of Blanchot, who writes in the Space of Literature that Heidegger's system of thought, along with Hegel's and Nietzsche's, attempts to make death possible. Mortality is fundamental both for Heidegger and Levinas, but what is in question is what it means for death to be fundamental. Let me briefly outline 4 points which need to be understood in order to begin to grasp the significance of Levinas's critique of Heidegger's conception of being towards death. The first concerns the inseparability of death from murder, according to Levinas. Murder is at the origin of death, Levinas tells us. It is, he says, as though murder, rather than being one of the occasions of dying, were inseparable from the essence of death. Why is murder at the origin of death, according to Levinas? Because, in part, in both killing and dying, there is an effort to, as he says, escape from being, to go where freedom and negation operate. Death approaches, for Levinas, not as nothingness, but as fear, fear for my being, fear of violence. By emphasizing not only that death involves fear of being, but also its essential unknowability, Levinas retrieves precisely the aspects of death that Heidegger designates as inauthentic. refusing the alternative of being and nothingness that the tradition presents us with for negotiating death, in which we might imagine it, in Levinas's words, either as a passage to nothingness or as a passage to another existence. Levinas includes Heidegger in this alternative, not because Heidegger is concerned with life after death. Heidegger explicitly distances himself from offering any opinion on this question, but because death is understood by Heidegger as the nothingness upon which I project any possibility whatsoever. Second point concerns death and time, and more specifically it concerns the extent to which Levinas's critique of the Heideggerian being towards death is not only bound up with, but is also at the same time a critique of Heidegger's conception of temporality. One might want to claim, on the basis of the fact that Heidegger grants existentiale status or existential status to being towards death and Mitsein or being with, that Levinas is wrong to criticize Heidegger for prioritizing my death over the other's death. Doesn't Heidegger see them as equiprimordial, as structural to the world? Isn't there a constant recognition by Heidegger that authentic anticipation of one's own death only takes place in terms of an acceptance of others? In Being and Time, we read, quote, as the non-relational possibility, death individualizes, but only in such a manner that, as the possibility which is not to be outstripped, it makes Dasein, as being with, have some understanding of the potentiality of being for others, end quote. Notwithstanding the existential status of being with others as equiprimordial with Dasein's own most possibility for death, it remains the case that for Heidegger, authentic death is a return from, a recovery of, one's possibilities from the inauthenticity of the they-self in which death is covered up. Dasein as finite remains fundamentally alone. Even the call of conscience comes from Dasein itself. A full discussion of the sense in which Levinas's critique of the Heideggerian conception of being towards death is bound up with a critique of the ecstatic conception of temporality would have to articulate what can only be signaled here, namely that Levinas sees Heidegger's account of time as totalizing, an account which dispenses with the irreducible singularity of the instant. Here we rejoin Rosenzweig's idea of eternal life, which arises, quote, this is a quote from Levinas, on the basis of irreducible and fresh quasi-Bergsonian instants and outside the petrified system in which conceptual philosophy imprisons such moments, end quote. The third point concerns language and death, and more particularly the sense in which Levinas accepts the fundamental connection that Heidegger establishes between death and language, but how he also reworks this connection. Like the origin of me voici, here I am, what Levinas calls the first word, thou shalt not kill, comes from elsewhere, from another shore. I am not the master of this original, originary, and anarchical, and therefore also not originary speech. The other dictates the sense of my words, and I discover in my words my response. This is not a spontaneous, free speech. I do not project my meaning. I do not anticipate my response. I do not coincide with myself. I am not, first of all, an autonomous being. I find myself uprooted by the other's command. I am powerless. The temptation of murder is also prohibited, elicited, and prohibited in one movement. The face of the other, says Levinas, quote, expresses my moral impossibility of annihilating. This interdiction is, to be sure, not equivalent to pure and simple impossibility, and even presupposes the possibility which precisely it forbids. But in fact, the interdiction already dwells in this very possibility, rather than presupposing it, end quote. As Jill Robbins asks, does not murder aim at speech itself? Levinas's understanding of the relation between speech and murder, to quote Jill Robbins again, suggests the enigmatic relation between murder and primordial speech. It suggests the way in which the impossibility of murder inhabits the language relation to the other at its origin, end quote. In Blanchot's words, quoted by Robbins, the choice is either to speak or to kill, and it is speech that founds the alternative. The fourth and final point I want to make in this regard concerns the way in which Levinas's assertion of the priority of ethics over ontology is both implicated in and implicates his insistence that death is to be understood not as the possibility of impossibility, but precisely the reverse, as the impossibility of possibility. There is an assumption that informs Heidegger's analysis of death, that Dasein's character lies in its possibility. Emil Fackenheim says, quote, "In Being and Time, historicity emerges as permeating man's very being, and hence as inescapable. Yet far from being a curse, its core, man's being toward death, is the decisive condition of all true human freedom. Man is free to live his own life only because he is free to die his own death," end quote. In Heidegger's words, it is in death that Dasein's character as possibility lets itself be revealed most precisely. Or, as Levinas says, death in Heidegger is an event of freedom. For Levinas, the character of Dasein is not fundamentally possibility. I am not, first of all, a power or a freedom to be, whether or not this is cashed out in terms of potentiality for being. I am, first of all, sensibility, passivity, responsibility. As passivity and exposure to the other, I am not, first of all, a potentiality for anything, least of all death. That death is represented for Levinas by the irrecusability of the other, that death cannot be thought without also thinking murder, is a function of his refusal to take the potentiality for being as the basic determinative character of Dasein. Levinas asks if there is not a more basic meaning in death than the understanding that sees in it a setting oneself free for one's own possibilities. Does this more basic meaning consist in being free to be free for others, in the sense of being free to recognize a prior claim that another has on me? Not to recognize that prior claim, not to be free to do so, may be the empirical reality of extreme cruelty, but far from being the exercise of freedom, it constitutes precisely the extremity of cruelty. It is surely not enough to reserve the term inauthentic for those who freely and willingly, even righteously, reduced others to a state in which murder was not merely permissible but obligatory in order to survive. A new way of thinking about death, freedom, and others must be found. In the face of accounts by Jewish witnesses to their experiences in concentration camps, how can an account of being towards death that establishes an absolute distinction between the ways in which humans and animals have of dying remain relevant? What can it mean to insist on the ultimacy of death as being free for possibilities, free for life, when we are confronted with a situation in which the cost of survival is to kill one's own? What can it mean to assert an essential connection between death and language, as if by doing so one is confirming the humanity of individuals, where humanity is systematically and methodically destroyed, where individuality is replaced by wild animality, where respect for the dignity of persons is replaced by a blind will to survive that is beyond recognition of the sanctity of life, even in the person of one's own family members? Levinas isolates two specifically Jewish traits of Rosenzweig's analysis in The Star of Redemption. One is that love is manifested as commandment. The other is that the individual mediates redemption. In a world where Jews were not allowed to die their own death, where the possibility of transcendence, which is required in order for love, not of this world, to manifest itself as commandment, and where individuals were deprived of their role as mediators of redemption, what is left of humanity? The final section of the paper, which is short, is called Thinking After Levinas. This paper was conceived not only in the shadow of the Shoah, but also in the shadow of Levinas's death. If, in the context of this conference, my title could be taken to refer to the impossibility of an event such as the Shoah having happened, the moral impossibility of it, the impossibility of containing it in thought, readers of Levinas will have recognized also in the phrase impossible possibility another reference, a reference to Levinas's understanding of death as the impossibility of possibility, itself a reference to and a reversal of the Heideggerian understanding of death as the possibility of impossibility. This occasion has for me a peculiar poignance. It is the first paper that I have delivered concerning Levinas since his death. It is then the first time that I will have thought and written and presented a paper about a thinker who has had a most profound impact on my work and on my life in his absence from this world. His death represents an end, the ending, first of all, of the ending of certain possibilities that never were realized, which might never have been realized, but which now never can be realized. One might say, bearing in mind Heidegger's celebrated analysis of death, that a certain potentiality for being has been removed for Levinas, but not for us. To think after Levinas, that is our task, those of us who take his philosophy seriously. Given what we know of Levinas's philosophy, it seems inappropriate for me to translate this task into a question about what my response to his life's work should be. If I may frame this in the light of Levinas's critique of the Heideggerian conception of death, to ask what my response should be is still to posit my freedom as basic, as if I have a choice to respond to Levinas's ethical challenge or not. The force of Levinas's philosophy lies not in the recognition of a choice, but in the recognition that it is already too late to pose the issue of responsibility in these terms. Given that the Shoah has occurred, given this ineluctable fact, what then is the appropriate question, the right question? Perhaps I had better ask not how my response will appear, which assumes that the sort of response that is at stake is one that can appear as such. Better to ask how responsible my response will have been, not according to the realm of appearances or phenomena, but according to the other for whom I am responsible. Of course, this is an impossible question for me to answer. It may be an impossible question for me to pose, but perhaps the effort of attempting to formulate it, even in its impossibility, is not one that will have been wasted. We have to ask, in what sense impossible questions remain impossible, and in what sense they remain possible. It may be that the impossibility of adequately formulating a question about responsibility, the responsibility of my response, is inseparable from the possibility of asking the question. It may turn out that the question of responsibility is impossible in the sense that it can never be definitively posed, still less answered in any definite way. This failure to pose the question once and for all, this necessity to continue to insist that it remain a question and that I remain in question along with my responsibility, may be precisely the impossibility of the question. In this very impossibility, it may be that we also find its necessity, its imperative, its unavoidability, its incessant return. Here I am. I quote these words as a testimony to Levinas, whose death has affected me deeply over the past 5 months in ways that I found myself quite unprepared for. But beyond this, if to testify is to testify to the infinite, the words Levinas quotes so often from Isaiah, "Here I am," point beyond philosophy to a restlessness, to an ethics that can never rest. Levinas, both as a philosopher and as a survivor of the Shoah, has asked, perhaps more insistently than any other philosopher, after the meaning of ethics. To be answerable to his legacy is to see that ethics in our era can no longer be a call to responsibility, as if it were a duty abstractly outlined, a future possibility yet to be realized. Ethics is a responsibility to which I, unique and irreplaceable, come always too late. Whether this means one should go out into the world ethically or stay close to God is a matter of religion, but it is not merely a matter of arbitrary choice. I do not mean to end with a demand to be religious in any conventional sense. I recall religion as a dedication to Levinas's insight that to testify is to bear witness to the infinite. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chanter. Our next speaker is Professor Robert Gibbs. Professor Gibbs has been teaching in the religion department at Princeton University for several years now, and he's about to take up a position in the philosophy department at the University of Toronto. His first book was entitled Correlations in Rosenzweig and Levinas. That book came out from Princeton University Press in 1992. That book is considered by many to be a definitive work on these crucial 20th century Jewish thinkers, and it was named a National Jewish Book Award honor book. He's now at work on a book entitled Why Ethics? Signs of Responsibility. This book will also be coming out from Princeton University Press. What I find amazing about Professor Gibbs' work is its synthetic nature. He works at the juncture between philosophy and religious studies, while at the same time drawing on disciplines such as literary theory, social theory, and history. He speaks in a voice which is simultaneously informed by intellectual traditions as diverse as German idealism, postmodernism, existentialism, American pragmatism, and traditional Jewish thought. Please welcome Robert Gibbs, who's going to speak to us today on the topic, Why Ethics?
I will claim today that the defining question of philosophy is why. It defines our stricken minds in the face of the Shoah, as it defines our philosophical lethargy at the end of this century. Philosophers have often bestowed upon the question what the crown of honor. At times they have moved from what to how, or even to who. But there is a steady and telling undercurrent that asks, why? Why leads beyond the Aristotelian final cause to examine the positions occupied by the questioner and the respondent. The relation between those positions is the point of departure for a recent ethics, an ethics derived from both Levinas and Rosenzweig. But before I examine the way that asking why works, I wish first to reflect on ethics. Section 1. Ethics is not ethical action. Indeed, my title should first be read, Why Ethics? Why not history? Or even, why not just do what is right? The latter I will call ethical action. But ethics itself is a philosophical discipline, a mode of inquiry, a way of thinking about doing what is right. And it is not clear at all that any kind of theoretical reflection on what is right is adequate or even worth our time. Why do this kind of studying called ethics? Why indeed? For in response to the Shoah, in response to Hiroshima, in response to the Gulag, in response to Bosnia and Rwanda, and so on, there are few of us who do not already know what we ought to do. We must prevent all such atrocities. We must not collaborate or perpetrate genocide. We must not stand by and allow it to happen to others. We must ensure that our children are schooled to not allow and to not tolerate not only such unimaginable violence, but we must also teach them to resist and denounce and combat the intermediary steps towards such violence. We all know these duties. We must do them, and that is what is ethical. The Shoah requires us to act, not only to know. Studying ethics, however, is not engaging in one of these profoundly worthwhile actions. In fact, it is an activity that is in some ways inactive. Are you all sure that coming to a conference and thinking about a set of somewhat boring and abstract papers is the best use of your time in response to the Shoah? Shouldn't you be out doing something right now? We all came here to speak and listen to each other talking about what we ought to do. Maybe telling others to do those extremely ethical actions is even higher than doing them. Maybe giving a sermon or an address of moral exhortation, an edifying discourse, maybe those also are ways of acting ethically. Maybe they are even more important because they can inspire and lead others to do what is right. But then, shouldn't you have gone to a leadership conference or taken a homiletics course? Why did you come to study ethics when you could have either chosen to spend the time fighting injustice, or at least learning how to encourage others to fight injustice. In short, ethics is not simply an engagement in the complex world of social and political conflict. Acting ethically is not the same as studying ethics. Ethics itself is not defined by its edifying and sermonic function. To those of you familiar with Rosenzweig's and Levinas's texts, you will, I hope, readily agree that they are surprisingly uninterested in telling a reader how to behave, and that the task and activity of thinking about ethical action dominates their work. Ethics is a philosophical discipline, so we can ask the question, why ethics? Precisely because its contribution to our ethical world must be refracted through our minds. Ethics does not engage the fight against injustice and genocide, and it does not merely exhort us to the fight. As such, many of you, I hope, are indeed wondering whether there is any good reason for studying ethics in a time where the responsibilities to alleviate suffering are so massive and so urgent. Why ethics indeed? The question becomes all the worse, however, when we begin considering Rosenzweig's own relation to the discipline called ethics. For Rosenzweig did not think that ethics led to or contributed to a proper understanding of what we should do. I myself have helped conjoin Levinas and Rosenzweig, but the conjunction depends on a somewhat complex account of how rational ethics can become displaced by a new ethics, an ethics of the interpersonal, an ethics of discourse and gesture. And to give a sense of the refashioning of ethics at work here, I'll now turn to the second major theme of my paper, rationality and ethics. Rosenzweig's teacher, Hermann Cohen, was the greatest of the neo-Kantians and led a struggle to redevelop ethics as a formal, pure, rational discipline. He championed the power of reason to define what we ought to do. Through a deductive logic, reason generated a system of ethical duties and rights. Rosenzweig broke with his teacher on the motives and the results of this rational ethical system. He complained that the formalism left the process of interpretation or application too vague and indeed simply indeterminable. A formal ethics, so the argument goes, cannot tell us what to do in any circumstance. The process of deducing application leaves the ethics floating in midair. But the deeper critique of such idealistic ethics appears in Rosenzweig's discussion of philosophy and its failure to recognize the reality of death. In the shadow of World War I, Rosenzweig identified the motive of rational philosophy, including and especially its ethics, as a flight from the fear of death. The point of departure for Rosenzweig's whole work was the analysis of how thought was employed to fend off the fear of death, indeed to deny death its sting. In this context, philosophy represents a daring and powerful evasion of the brutality and reality of the deaths of individual people, deaths whose terror cannot be borne. In order to avoid confronting the reality of death, especially the violent death of thousands and millions, philosophy pretends that death is nothing. Philosophy's pretensions to know it all, to grasp and control all that is through its concepts and categories, forms a totality to which there is no outside. Death, unknowable and terrifying, must not be. Ethics, in the context of this idealistic rationalist philosophy, interprets both the ethical act and its agent through what can be known in advance. Rosenzweig claims that it reduces the agent to a personality type, a general sort of person whose ethical qualities can be readily grasped. The brute specificity of my own death and my unique fear of my own death is absorbed into a personality type that is cowardly. I am, in my very uniqueness, reasoned away. But even the private source of my act, my will, that is interpreted only by its result, by its effect on the world. Rosenzweig claims that the apparently undiscernible will has been grasped by locating it in its world and in the world's history. The ramifications of ethics into the institutions of the state and into the story of the world serves to dissolve that part of ethics which cannot be known. Ethics, in its philosophical form, had reduced the ethical person into a rationally catalogued type and reduced the goodwill into its worldly results. But beginning with Kierkegaard and continuing with Nietzsche, ethics was suspended. Rosenzweig terms this the meta-ethical. The self discovers that it lies beyond the horizons of rational ethics. The meta-ethical is the way into the first part of Rosenzweig's star. Pardon me a second. Where thought accepts limits on its ability and accepts death's humiliation. Kierkegaard and others discovered that my own relation to my own death and life is not simply part of the rationally known world. Myself, which rational principles cannot know, will now orient thinking. Kierkegaard writes of the teleological suspension of the ethical, Nietzsche of beyond good and evil. Rosenzweig is clear that the meta-ethical is not the anti-ethical. Ethics remains as a part of the way of describing human personality and the world around us. But some other thinking arises out of the discovery that I, myself as thinker, as ethics specialist, am more than merely an ethical agent. In part one of the star, Rosenzweig constructs three new disciplines from the premise that there are elements which could in principle not be known: God, world, and the self. For Rosenzweig, each emerges as a point of inaccessibility, and in order to be hidden, each must have a specific constitution. The meta-ethical self is a relation of character and defiance, an heroic self that is incomparable. This self resembles Heidegger's authentic Dasein of a few years later. For this self is authentically bound to its own death as a way of persisting in its own being. Such a particular, isolated, and lonely human is not anti-ethical, but has a relation to herself that reason cannot found. Her own identity is occluded from her community, from her family, from her God or gods. The imperatives that the world and reason present still obligate her relatively. The imperative to be true to herself is the only absolute. For Rosenzweig, the articulation of the meta-ethical self requires a negative logic. If ethics could only produce a system that misunderstood the self and excluded the reality of death, then ethics seems rather useless for the challenge that meets us today. From the context of authenticity, we might wish to allow ethics a descriptive function, telling us about what the world expects of us and how reason and law might use qualities of human actors to classify their competence and their guilt. But we would hardly expect ethics to offer us real insight into the responsible self, much less into a drama of selves who are responding to each other. Ethics might be fine for a historical portrait of an age, but it would be beside the point for addressing us in our most critical need, the need to respond to catastrophe and human violence. It could never reach to me. And thus, perhaps, from the perspective of Rosenzweig's own system, nothing would be more dubious than a conference on ethics, particularly in response to a disaster of the proportion of the Holocaust. It is, of course, to Levinas that we turn to redeem ethics, that is, to justify why ethics. Levinas claims that ethics is first philosophy and reinvents the discipline in a marked departure from the formal, pure, idealistic, rational ethics that Rosenzweig criticized. We would, however, miss the consonance of the two philosophers, and indeed the challenge to ethics itself, were we to ignore Levinas's critique of philosophical reasoning. Our point of departure for Levinas's ethics will again be the suspension of the totality that philosophy has claimed. Levinas is not only a philosopher of the infinite, for totality serves a complex role in his thought. Levinas does not simply oppose ethics to reason or the face of the other person to thought. Rather, the two sides are bound together, totality and infinity. But the shortcomings of totality in Levinas closely parallel Rosenzweig's critique of reason. Levinas also portrays philosophical reason as a safe path through the dangers of living and dying in the world. Shining its illuminating beam on all that it can, reason manages everything that can appear. Reason itself is the organizing and subordinating agent, forming general classes into which individual experiences are placed. The world is rounded up and assimilated to the thinker who knows it. What is other must be recognized as what is the same. This making same protects the thinker from experiences that cannot be thought and controlled. Experiences such as insomnia, aging, dying, and of course, approaching the other person. Even knowing another person requires a violating of what is truly other about the other person. Reason in Levinas becomes violent in a telling resonance with Rosenzweig. Reason insulates the thinker from the interruptions and challenges of what stands beyond the totality. Levinas then explores how the other person interrupts totality, calling me into question. The thinker, like the neutral self in Rosenzweig, is not yet located in a context. Indeed, thought abstracts the context, seeking escape from the vulnerability of being with others. Responsibility begins when another person faces me, addressing me, challenging me, calling to me, approaching near to me, when the thinker's I becomes a me. The suspended self of a transcendental subject becomes a hostage for another person, liable and bound to respond. If rational ethics sought either a space in which all agents were anonymous rational beings, or at best sought an autonomous I, who should give himself a law, then ethics begins all over again with me. Not only is Levinas's ethics not about anonymous beings, but it is also not oriented by a self who must respond only to and for herself. Ethics begins with me, and I am then bound to respond, to answer. Ethics is not about having the first move. My responsibility to answer, moreover, is not reciprocal. It is not conditional on the other person's responsiveness. My responsibility is asymmetrical, weighing upon me more than upon the other person. But a me is not merely a cog in a machine, nor simply a direct object of an act. I become me in the moments in which I am bound to others, in which I have to deal with what I do not choose. And it is me who so must deal. For some other person, I have become irreplaceable. The hunted one knocks on my door, and I cannot respond that someone ought to harbor her, someone else. No, it is my responsibility. And being assigned, I become who I am. The elusive particularity of the self that Kierkegaard and Nietzsche extolled beyond ethics is, according to Levinas, not given to the I in solitude, but arises through others. That particularity is the other's inaccessibility, her freedom to call me and to teach me. What escapes the totality of rational systems ultimately is the relation to someone whose otherness calls to me and disrupts my world. Rational ethics presumed that knowing came first and that responsibilities were freely chosen. Levinas now proposes that the other's call to me comes first. The other implicates me, and I must respond before I know the principle which justifies action, before I know the consequences of action, and indeed before I know the other person. While rational ethics struggled to subject myself and everyone else equally to principles that could be known in advance and which could norm behavior, making ethical action predictable and steady, Levinas finds ethics to emerge in and be bound to the surprise that awaits me in each new meeting with another person. I cannot rationally predict to what I will have to respond, because the other person retains the authority to interpret her own words. What escapes a rational ethical system is not my private relation to my death, but the contours of a relation with another person. Ethics is a responsibility for the other, a responsibility that precedes any act of knowing. Levinas does not merely engage in ethical action. Instead, his own activity is to reflect rationally upon these unpredictable relations, these responsibilities that emerge in a context with only limited freedom. If we had just concluded that rational ethics might not be worth our time as a response to the Shoah, though we might now conclude that in bearing the ethical responsibility Levinas proposes, we also have no time for reasoning about responsibility. Ethics as a study is still not ethical. Why ethics again? Levinas does not ground ethics in reason, but he does claim that reason begins in ethics, that it is ethical to reason. Reason becomes a way of responding to another person, a specific way of answering the call. In reasoning, I form general concepts under which several of us can gather, while ethics begins, for Levinas, in a tomb-term relation between me and another person. Speaking to the other person invokes others, other people for whom what I say in response to this other person will bear meaning. The generality of a sign is a generality of its audience, and that generality is justified by recourse to the response to a single other. Reason requires justification by ethics, but ethics also requires reasoning. The need to address multiple others, to answer and to balance multiple responsibilities, produces a reasoning with general signs. There is room not only for reasoning, but even for talking about reasoning. Responsibility can produce not only a kind of reasoning, but responsibility also can produce the study of responsibility, ethics. I will turn to the ethical justification of theorizing when I discuss prophecy in the last section of this paper. But if ethics can emerge as a study of the responsibility of interpersonal relations in Levinas, can we not go back to Rosenzweig and find him also engaged in this interpersonal ethics, an ethics not of rational formal principles, but of relations and speech? Indeed, where but in Part 2 of the Star do we find such a full account of asymmetrical responsibilities? Let us, with all due apologies, call his study of the relations of creation, revelation, and redemption a kind of ethics, for it closely resembles Levinas's renewed and reoriented ethics. The move from Part 1 to Part 2 in the Star is a move from isolated elements to interrelation, but it also is a move from thought to speech. Rosenzweig, like Buber, Marcel, and others, discovered that speaking and listening existentially locate me in relation to a you. While thought goes on anywhere, speech to another person binds the speaker and listener in space and time, to a here over against a there, to a now that must await a later, when the other person will respond to me. Rosenzweig focuses on the moment of revelation in which I am addressed by a command, the command of commands, the command, love me. That command interrupts the abstracted world of thought, awakening the self from its enclosure. To hear that command is to be related and to be capable of responding to another. Being addressed changes the self into a me, into a soul, which can transform itself, learning to respond to the other. I will not lead you through the drama of books 2 and 3 of Part 2, the dialogue and emergence into communal singing, nor will I examine the cry or scream that punctuates the gap between revelation and redemption. Instead, I will briefly indicate that the kind of ethical relations that are struck in speaking, in singing, in prayer, and in reading. This open set of actions, each of which is an act that signifies, that uses signs, implicate the participants in various responsibilities. To exhort a community to sing with me, to sing with us, is to perform a relation with others, and to be responsible with the others for each other. The ought of communal responsibility is not derived through a rational deduction from general principles, but is performed together in using our voices and bodies. The ethical dimension emerges through the action and is not derived from a prior conceptual schema. To interpret the way these actions bind the participants and the ethical exigencies in these relations, we must examine them through the performances of using signs, in which the participants implicate themselves in the signs. I reveal myself to another, speaking myself, and not only about myself, witnessing, and so risking myself in so speaking. The promise, the confession, the apology, the exhortation, these actions are the medium in which we act ethically. And so the listening in which we are dressed, the opening which interrupts us, is a moment of transcendence. Something new has happened to me, demanding that I respond, but also enabling me to strike a relation with another in a way that I not only could not do, but could not even predict. Unlike the stable and continuous derivations of rational ethics, these dialogic or interpersonal ethics are intrinsically discontinuous and unpredictable. The remaining question for Rosenzweig is how the communal and interpersonal ethics relate to the rational ethics he disparaged and moved beyond to start part 1. How does rational thought arise from the interpersonal relations of speaking? Levinas's account of reason moving from language back to thought can serve us again. The power of reason to determine a systematic ethics derives from the responsibilities that arise and are performed in speaking and listening. But what about the kind of thinking Rosenzweig used to produce the meta-ethical? How do we discover the meta-ethical self, the enclosed particular self who does not speak nor answer for anyone? Rosenzweig made a surprising argument in part 1 of The Star that reason can be turned against itself to produce a hypothetical negative of rational ethics. The self bound to its own death, authentic and silent, hidden from world and God. He claims that only such a constructed self can be capable of entering relations with God and the world that happen in listening and answering. But if reasoning is born of speech, then even this authentic meta-ethical self takes the stage only after revelation, after relations have made it able to respond. Indeed, Rosenzweig regularly comments that the isolation of the elements is discovered only after relations have begun. The self, by itself, does not know how lonely it is. For Rosenzweig, then, there are 3 moments organized in different sequences. The narrated sequence is from 1, rational ethics, where the individuality of the agent is lost under general concepts, to 2, a meta-ethics, where the self is formulated as a hidden, defiant character bound to death and true to itself beyond reason, and then 3, an interpersonal ethics, where a me responds to a command and then enters relations with other individuals and within communities, an ethics performed in language and gesture. But a second sequence recognizes that the meta-ethics only appears as what it is when viewed from interpersonal ethics. Indeed, in this second order, we notice that rational ethics is simply a false direction, misleading us away both from relations and from the irreducible authenticity of meta-ethics. What I would call ethics, then, is not simply inverting rational ethics. Rather, it requires the meta-ethics that identifies the self beyond rational compass. Moreover, the complications of the 2 sequences we have opened up here are just the complications that challenge the phenomenological narrative in Levinas's totality and infinity. Even this new ethics seems to be almost too entangled, if not in rational ethics with its subordinating concept, at least in the negative task of isolating an authentic self. Formal universal reason, if only in this negative function, seems to be an inherent shadow of an interpersonal ethics. We have not simply replaced the rational system and its totalizing tendencies by this much more contextual and unpredictable ethics. Section 3, Semiotics and Ethics. If for both Rosenzweig and Levinas, the relations of interpersonal ethics to reason and its formal ethics is somewhat more complex than we might like, we might find a clearer way forward if we more decisively switch frameworks by adopting semiotics. What I propose is that if we allow the linguistic turn to govern our interpretation of this new ethics, we may find a close fit of semiotics and ethics. That semiotics needs this ethics, and that this ethics fits well with semiotics. I would begin with a simple tripartite division of semiotics in the manner of Charles Morris, but following much more closely the work of Peter Oakes, who has already negotiated a rapprochement between pragmatics and Jewish thinkers. Semiotics is in general the study of signs, and divides into three fields, each of which studies a dimension or facet of a sign. Semantics examines how a sign refers or relates to an object or idea, a percept or concept. Syntactics examines how a sign relates to other signs, how meaning builds through a web of other signs. Pragmatics examines how a sign relates to its user, to the speaker, writer, reader, listener. Meaning is a concoction of all 3 relations in varying mixtures, depending on what is being signified. In this framework, the focus of ethics is pragmatics. When Levinas distinguishes the saying from the said, He is noting that pragmatic meaningfulness is not simply semantic content. He does not address the semantics of ethical discourse. What does duty or right mean? But rather the pragmatics of discourse. What happens and what responsibilities arise in speaking to each other? The speaker or listener positions arise as nexes of responsibilities. Ethics is not about rational beings with derivable duties, but it is about how listening implicates a listener in some responsibilities. These positions do involve self-relations, but those relations themselves are formed as responsibilities for using signs. Confessing, for example, profoundly changes the confessing person, but those changes transform the speaker position itself, adding a new range of capacities. What a confession means, therefore, is not simply the semantic content of the words, nor even the more important relation between the words used now to the words used in the past. But importantly, the confession's meaning includes consideration of how the speaker relates to the confession. Beyond the connection we can draw from interpersonal ethics to pragmatics, there is a more profound reason to opt for a semiotic approach to ethics. Semiotics has for itself a relation from something, the sign, to another. Indeed, a sign means something to someone. The relationality is not reflexive, but is directional or asymmetric. And the relationality is not derivative from other elements, but constitutes the being of the sign. Hence, if we are searching for a medium in which to discern the asymmetric responsibilities from me to another, the model of signs is more suitable than one of entities or processes. A sign is for another, and so the question is how ethics can discern an ethical dimension to signification. The key, not surprisingly, is the way that the user of signs becomes what we might call an existential or personal sign. That is, the speaker or listener becomes a sign for another person, assigned a meaning as for the other. From the perspective of ethics, the nature of witnessing, confessing, and joining to sing together, and a wide range of gestures, all make the user into a sign for others. Moreover, they expose the signer to misinterpretation at the hands of others. Using a sign is risking misinterpretation, and making a sign of myself, or being made into a sign, is to be at risk myself. The root of linguistic signification becomes the human sign. Ethical relations requiring risk in responding to others are the conditions for linguistic signification. Pragmatics calls the feature of a sign that indicates the specificity of speakers and listeners' indexicality. The thisness is not reducible to a semantic meaning. For instance, here means different places if I move around. But the sign, the Golden Gate Bridge, means the same place wherever the writer or reader sits. Here is where someone is speaking or writing. It refers to the positioning of the user. Similarly, you is indexical. Just who is you depends on to whom I am speaking, and cannot be determined through the sign itself. The asymmetry of interpersonal ethics fits extremely well with the indexicality studied by pragmatics. Moreover, to reason about indexicality, to frame a general concept of spatial indexicality, for instance, is to describe a sign that will not have the same sort of indexicality that the spatial indexicals thus described have. Indeed, reasoning about indexicality is framing a general discourse that can depart from the specificity of the indexical dimension of signs. Framing an ethics of asymmetry is also not simply reiterating the ethical relations that singles me out and assigns me for another person. If a general discourse can succeed in identifying the specificity of a sign, then it may also be possible to justify a general discourse, call it ethics, that examines and has constant recourse to the specificity that is asymmetrical responsibility. If pragmatics can model ethics, particularly with indexicality, then now is the moment to rephrase my title. Why ethics becomes why ethics. Another topic for pragmatics is how why questions work. When someone asks why, there is no absolutely satisfying answer. Rather, the question invokes a context which determines just what would count as a good answer. The questioning and answering occur in a limited situation, reflecting the specific demands of the questioner, and not an abstract canon of adequate final causation. As such, why questions cannot be interpreted fully with semantics and syntax, but require the added insights of pragmatics. And in a book that I'm now finishing called Why Ethics, each chapter is titled Why X. For instance, why listen, why speak, why read, why comment, why judge, why translate, why remember. Each question addresses a pragmatic action, an action that uses signs in a specific way. The topics for this ethics are the responsibilities implicit in each way of using signs. Each action has its own ways of involving the actors in responsibilities in relation to others. But the use of why questions alerts us to the fundamental structure of the study called ethics. It is a situated response to others. The questions call for context-bound justifications. The why signals the ethical need to answer another, the exigency to justify. What requires ethical justifications are actions using signs that bind me to others, and the need for that justification itself arises in relation to others. Reason itself does not interrogate me. Reason itself does not interrogate me about why I should obey the laws of the state, a matter for rational ethics. But reason also does not interrogate me about why I should translate, a richly semiotic and pragmatic activity. Rather, the need to justify translating emerges in response to others. Ethics not only deals with interpersonal matters, its own call arises interpersonally. Hence, the pragmatics of why questions help us interpret the ethical dimensions of studying ethics. For semiotics, moreover, this moment marks the fulfillment of the linguistic turn, a turn in part achieved by Rosenzweig. For semiotics has still not produced an ethics that maintains a broad enough scope. Action theory, even as pragmatic as Habermas's, is still not ethics as pragmatics. With the semiotic turn, we replace an ontology of beings and processes with one of signs. A sign moves beyond itself, moreover, and moves at some risk, with some due contingency. Ethics can now articulate the riskiness of responsibilities without ascribing the risk to a deficiency. Moreover, the specificity of the relations from you to me can be articulated as pragmatic positions, as speaker or listener positions. We can now see this specificity not as a wayward particularity needing a general concept in order to be validated. The claim that pragmatics cannot be reduced to semantics safeguards the specificity of signs. Pragmatics itself is a formal or general discourse, much as ethics is, even Levinas's. But it is a formal discourse that does not claim to deduce the specific instances about which it reflects. The very particularity of context of a me, called by another to account, cannot be produced by reason, but can only be interpreted after the fact by reason. Peirce called this abduction and installed it at the heart of inquiry. The tension between formal discourse and interpersonal relations, between ethics and ethical relations, cannot be dissolved, but pragmatics is the best model for it. And although I must add that pragmatics has never quite sounded like this, neither ordinary language philosophy, nor speech act theory, nor universal pragmatics have managed to forge an ethics of the sort that I claim for Rosenzweig and Levinas. My last section, section 4, is short. It's called Philosophy and the Holocaust, and I will start it and then break. I would like to turn to the question that governs this conference, which is not simply why ethics, but more specifically, why ethics after the Holocaust. I suspect you will hear others say what I now wish to claim, that ethics after the Holocaust is impossible. Again, I do not mean that ethical actions have been rendered impossible. The opposite, ethical action becomes more imperative and is not too far from us. Rather, any coherent discourse called ethics is inadequate to the task. And in a few minutes, I will explain what I'm doing.
I'll give you it back here.